Kia ora,
Kia ora.
and welcome along to this walk tour. My name's Gareth,
And I'm Roger.
and together we're...
Roger and Gareth.
And today we're going to be doing the Violet Walk Tour, which starts in Parliament grounds here in Wellington, New Zealand, and will end up on the waterfront. So it takes around about an hour. So we are live streaming and we can see the comments on YouTube, so you're more than welcome to drop us a note on YouTube, and we'll be able to respond to questions as well. Before we start, we should do some thank yous.
Yes, thank you to Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young for their research. Some of this tour is based on, and thank you to you for coming and watching this. That's a major plus, thank you.
That's a good plus. Okay, so let's start, and we're starting here in Parliament grounds.
Okay, so yes, hopefully you can see behind us. Yes, Parliament grounds and on the steps of Parliament, and it's a pretty good place for us to start. There's a photo which hopefully we'll be able to see shortly of the flags flying on one occasion in front of Parliament there. So they are the bisexual flag, the intersex flag, the rainbow flag and the transgender flag, which was quite a special occasion for them all to be flying at once. But you'll notice that they're flying at half-mast. Now that's because this photo was taken in March 2019, just a few days after the mosque attacks in Christchurch, and that coincided really with the start of the ILGA World Conference that was here in Wellington at that time. So this was only the second time that Parliament had flown these flags out the front there, but we'll talk a bit more about those flags a wee bit later on in the tour and what their significance is. But we should really start our tour maybe 50 years ago and on the other side of the world in July 1967, when the UK Parliament passed the Sexual Offences Act, which decriminalised homosexual acts between men aged over 21 in England and Wales. Now this followed the Wolfenden Report of the 1950s, which had recommended that homosexual behaviour should no longer be considered a criminal offence. Change was happening here in New Zealand too at that time, and the first meeting of the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society was held in Wellington in July 1967. But it wasn't until 1974 that there were a first major parliamentary attempt at reform. The National MP Ven Young introduced the Crimes Amendment Bill with an age of consent of 21. Keep in mind that for heterosexual sex the age of consent was 16. Now, the Labour Prime Minister at the time, Norman Kirk, opposed the bill. He said that he wouldn't support any legislation which treated homosexuality as normal behaviour. At the same time, though, gay and lesbian groups were forming around the country and were becoming more vocal. In July 1975, the Labour MP Gerald Wall moved an amendment to the Crimes Act that proposed imprisonment for anyone who communicated with a person under the age of 20 about homosexuality. Now, that means that support organisations that we know today, like Rainbow Youth or Inside Out or any high school peer support group, would have been made illegal. So there was a lot of opposition to this, as can be seen from this image here, taken on the steps of Parliament. Gerald Wall is on the left there. Ven Young's bill was ultimately defeated by 5 votes, so that was 34 to 29, but there were 23 abstentions, and that's important because it shows just how little politicians wanted to deal with the issue at that time.
But even if they didn't want to deal with the issue and the activists weren't going away. And so New Zealand had its first openly gay person stand for Member of Parliament in 1975, and that was Robin Duff. Now, Robin didn't get in, but went on to do huge amounts of work in the education sector. Rog, can you tell me who was the first openly gay Member of Parliament in New Zealand?
Would that be Chris Carter?
It was Chris Carter in 1993, so it wasn't that long ago. What about the first openly lesbian Member of Parliament?
I feel I want to say Marilyn Waring.
You could say Marilyn Waring, and Marilyn was in Parliament in the late 1970s. In fact, she wasn't out publicly as such. I mean, she was out to her friends and family, but generally no, and she was actually outed by the Truth newspaper, who ran like a month's worth of headlines around Marilyn's private life. It was really really disgusting, actually. But the first openly out lesbian member of Parliament before going into Parliament was actually Marion Street, and that was 2005. So again, that's very recent. What about the first openly transgender member of Parliament?
That'd have to be Georgina Beyer.
Georgina Beyer, and this is a wonderful photo of Georgina when she was mayor of Carterton District in just north of Wellington. And that was in the mid-1990s. And Georgina went into national politics around 1999. And she said a few years ago that one of her proudest moments was to welcome back Carmen Rupe, the iconic Carmen, back to New Zealand. Carmen was living at Sydney at the time, was back here for one of her birthdays. And Georgina welcomed Carmen back to Parliament, and where Carmen met the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister and a number of other out MPs. Carmen's last trip to Parliament, the time before, was in the 1970s when, in a television interview, she said that she knew of gay and bisexual members of Parliament. Because it was still illegal at the time, Parliament thought this was terrible, disgusting, and so they brought Carmen before the Privileges Committee at Parliament to answer questions about those claims. And Carmen subsequently apologised for making it, such a scurrilous accusation that you might be having kind of gay and bisexual members of Parliament.
How disreputable. Back to homosexual law reform at Parliament. On the 8th of March 1985, the Labour MP Fran Wilde introduced the Homosexual Law Reform Bill. Here's a great image of her in the lobby of Parliament there talking to supporters. Now, Fran's bill set out to decriminalise homosexual activity between adult consenting males and make it illegal to discriminate against anyone based on their sexual orientation. So it took 16 months of very heated and at times unpleasant debate, both in Parliament and out in the public. But eventually the first part of the bill, that which dealt with decriminalising homosexual acts between adult consenting males, passes on the 9th of July 1986. However, part 2 of the bill, that which dealt with discrimination, was lost at that time, and so it was still perfectly legal to discriminate against homosexuals. And I wonder, Gareth, whether you know which areas it was legal to discriminate.
Oh, I would probably say accommodation. I would say services. So somebody could not serve you in a shop. And employment. So you could be refused employment just for the fact that you might be gay.
You could lose your job, in fact, through it. This will change, though, with the Human Rights Act of 1993, which outlawed discrimination on the grounds of disability and HIV/AIDS, as well as sexual orientation. Now, the amendments to the Human Rights Act were championed by the Associate Minister of Health at the time, Catherine O'Regan, who passed away sadly in May 2018. In 2012, she apologised publicly for not specifically including transgender people in those anti-discrimination measures.
Well, in New Zealand, homosexual law reform, which was 85-86, was really entwined in the emergence of AIDS and HIV here in New Zealand. And both sides of the homosexual law reform debate used AIDS as one of the calls to action. The pro-reformers said that we need to decriminalise activity so we can get people to go to their doctors, to get checked, and provide wraparound services. And the anti-homosexual law reform campaigners said that basically legalising homosexuality would legalise the spread of AIDS. And that was a line that was taken by this chap. This was Norman Jones, and Norman Jones was the member of for Invercargill, member of Parliament for Invercargill. And Norman he had some vile things to say. He would, there were quotes of him saying things like, it would be better for people with AIDS to die sooner rather than later to help prevent the passing of homosexual law reform. At our next stop, we're going to be talking about one of the early AIDS activists here in New Zealand, and that stop is coming up very shortly. And what I'll do, I'll get Roger to talk as we virtually
walk down to opposite Turnbull House. So Turnbull House, which will be appearing very shortly behind us. Well, first we're going to take the virtual journey. Oh yes, that's right, to Turnbull House. It was the venue for an early community workshop on HIV/AIDS in New Zealand. There we go, there's Turnbull House. In the United States, in the 5th of June 1981, a report was published describing a cluster of 5 previously young, healthy gay men in Los Angeles who now had PCP, which is a form of pneumonia closely associated with what we now know as AIDS. And then on the 3rd of July, in an article in the New York Times, the headline was carried, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals." And by the end of that year, 121 people were known to have died.
In New Zealand, the first AIDS-related death was in 1984, and so we were a good couple of years behind what was happening in the US. But one of the things that happened at that time was there was no public organisation or even government organisation that was educating people around HIV and AIDS. Of course, at the time they didn't say HIV. But then we have people like Bruce Burnett, and Bruce Burnett was an Aucklander who had been living overseas in the 1970s and was actually living in San Francisco in the early 1980s, and so saw the first kind of wave of what was happening in the kind of rainbow communities in San Francisco. Feeling unwell himself, he came back to New Zealand in 1983, at the end of 1983, and saw that there was no one that was educating people around AIDS and its effects. And so he took it upon himself to do a one-man road trip around New Zealand, holding workshops in a whole variety of locations. And this is one of the reasons why we're here at Turnbull House, is because this was the first location in Wellington and one of the first locations in New Zealand where HIV and AIDS were discussed. In Palmerston North, Bruce actually came out to the group that he was talking to publicly as somebody with AIDS. And that was really courageous because at the time there was a lot of stigma and discrimination. For instance, they would, people would say things like, oh, you can't share the same utensils or go in the same swing baths or use the same toilet. All of it's complete rubbish. That's not how HIV is spread. Bruce not only came out to that group, but he also went to the media, and there's quite a lot of media coverage of Bruce talking on national TV about AIDS and safer sex practices. And so alongside this, Bruce and a number of other people were setting up the AIDS Support Network. And the AIDS Support Network was, again, a community initiative that was based on the Shanti Project in San Francisco. And that was all about supporting people with chronic illnesses. And it was like emotional support, financial support, and just practical day-to-day living support as well. So Bruce worked up right until his death. He died on the 1st of June 1985, and he was 30. And just a couple of months after that, the AIDS Support Network was transformed into the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. It got some government money and was transformed. Bruce is still remembered. A lot of people still remember Bruce, and it's his name, the Burnett Center, which is the New Zealand AIDS Foundation's Auckland clinic.
Well, someone else who was associated with Turnbull House here was the author, journalist and tarot card reader Tom Mclean. Now, Tom was a Scottish journalist who lived in New Zealand from 1973 until his death in 1989. Now, he wrote a book about his experiences living with HIV and AIDS called If I Should Die, and he was carried into Turnbull House here on a stretcher to launch that book on the 21st of March 1989, just 3 days before he died. And we've got an image here of Tom's memorial quilt panel on the AIDS memorial quilt. And an excerpt from that book, If I Should Die, is, "Remember my story about the garden. It's spring. You hold a tiny kitten in your hand and you tell me how each form of life, no matter how small, is part of life itself. When we understand space and time, we'll know that in infinity, all we have is here and now. And sometimes in the here and now, you'll turn a corner to find a little garden. We'll sit down together under a spring sun and watch the kitten and the caterpillar, and I'll tell you once again about the butterflies."
It's a lovely
quote.
Lovely quote, yeah. Now, the reason why Turnbull House is called Turnbull House is because of, let me just find, this photo is this chap, and this is Alexander Turnbull. And Alexander Turnbull was born in Wellington in 1868. He moved with his family back to the United Kingdom in 1875, but then returned here to New Zealand in his 20s. Now, Alexander was a merchant, and so he made quite a lot of money as a merchant, but he was also an avid collector, and he amassed in his lifetime 55,000 items. So we're talking books, manuscripts, photographs, physical objects, maps, a whole range of things. And he collected them, and then he had this wonderful house built in Bowen Street. This is Turnbull House. It's actually called Turnbull Library. It's called Turnbull House. And this was built in 1915 and held his entire collection. So before his death, he bequeathed the entire collection to the nation. And so this is where we get our first National Library collection. And as I say, 55,000 items. Unfortunately, Alexander died in 1918. He had an operation on his sinuses, and unfortunately there were some issues after that which he succumbed to. Alexander is actually buried in Bolton Street Cemetery, and just in the back of us here we've got Bolton Street Cemetery, and this is the gravestone of Alexander and also a number of his other family members, which are just buried just up the road.
Well, just down the road from here and from Turnbull House is Wellington Cenotaph. And for a number of years, 2 gay teachers laid a wreath here at the Cenotaph on Anzac Day in memory of fallen gay and lesbian service people. Now, because the wreath included a pink triangle, the RSA at the time deemed it to be too political, and so the practice was stopped. Another interesting thing about the Cenotaph is an inscription by the English war poet Rupert Brooke, and this inscription is on just above the doorway there to the Cenotaph, and it reads, "These laid the world away, poured out the red sweet wine of youth." Now that's an excerpt from one of Rupert Brooke's war sonnets, which he completed just before he died in 1915. Now, the Irish poet W.B. Yeats described Brooks as the handsomest young man in England, and in his mid-20s he visited Wellington, that's Brooke, in January 1914 on his way to Tahiti. Later that year, though, he was commissioned into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and took part in the Antwerp expedition. Early the next year, 1915, he was on his way to Gallipoli, but succumbed to an infected mosquito bite and died on a French hospital ship on the 25th of April 1915, so really just 2 days before the Gallipoli landings.
Gosh. We're going to move to our next stop now, so I'm just going to walk up the street as Roger talks to you.
Yes, so we're looking for Broadcasting House, which will be coming up, the site of it anyway, on the right there, we can see coming up shortly.
And it's actually on the left-hand side with the sculptures. What Broadcasting House used to look like was this building here, and so on the far right of the image is actually the street. That street's actually called Museum Street and was the first, that was the location of the Colonial Museum, so the New Zealand's first museum. The Colonial Museum then subsequently became the Dominion Museum, which then subsequently became Te Papa Museum of New Zealand. and so it all started back here in Museum Street. The reason why we're standing here virtually is that Broadcasting House used to be here, and Broadcasting House was built in the 1960s. It housed both the public radio, so Radio National. Concert wasn't actually, it was there too.
Broadcast from there. It didn't have offices in there, but it broadcast from there.
And also, the main reason why we're standing here is because Wellington Access Radio began here. And Wellington Access Radio was the first community access radio station here in New Zealand. And it kind of was born out of some people within Radio New Zealand who felt that the community wasn't being represented well by public broadcasting. So Wellington Access Radio began broadcasting on the 5th of April 1981, and the first broadcast had a feminist program called Leave Your Dishes in the Sink. And even though it wasn't a explicitly lesbian program, there were lesbians on the collective that made that program. And then on the 28th of June 1981, we had our first ever gay radio broadcast, and this was looking at Gay Pride 1981. When I say the first ever broadcast, this is the first time rainbow communities could make programs for themselves, about themselves. Prior to this point, there had been mainstream media coverage of homosexuality, but this is the first time when the community could actually speak to itself without having interference from an external editor. In 1984, we had our first broadcast of the lesbian community program, and that was run by a collective, and that collective ranged in size. It got up to about 30 members. It was a large collective and has been going continually since 1984. A couple of years ago, they actually changed their name to the acronym Quilted Bananas, and that stands for, quote, queer, intersectional, intersex, lesbian, takatapui, trans, NB non-binary, diverse, bisexual, asexual, and nanas, because a lot of us already identify as nanas. And the new title is about, quote, celebrating all the slippery overlaps these communities can have and how finding your identity within them can be messy but also fun. And this is a really fantastic example of just how times have changed. Back in the 1980s, you know, there might have been two or three, a handful of words that described gender and sexuality. And now, in today's, in modern times, there are just hundreds of words that are used to describe people's identities. And I think this is just a great example of how that radio show has actually moved with the times and has become a lot more inclusive.
Yeah. And as a way of connecting the community and advocating for homosexual law reform, Gay BC, that was the Gay Broadcasting Collective, began broadcasting weekly from Broadcasting House here from February 1985. And today Access Radio is based in Gusney Street, and it continues to have regular LGBTI rainbow broadcasts and podcasts.
And here's a lovely photo. This is Gay BC in the 1990s, which is really lovely. And you might be able to recognise a couple of very familiar faces. I think we've got Des and John, who received the first civil union in New Zealand, and they're just under the R's of queer and air. Yeah. I should also say a very warm welcome to our viewers on YouTube. We are watching YouTube as well. We're actually watching ourselves, not some other channel. So you're more than welcome to say hello via YouTube, and we'll be able to see that come through. Right, we're going to move now. This is a bit of a technological change. We're going to move through to the Terrace.
Yes, we're heading to St Andrews on the Terrace, and through the marvels of technology, we will head up the street, as you can see now, to St Andrews. There we go. Where on the 18th of June 2016, the world premiere of New Zealand composer Gareth Farr's choral work During These Days had its first performance. It was the first time that Gareth had composed something which he described as politically gay. The work was commissioned and performed by the Glamophones, and it marked the 30th anniversary then of homosexual law reform. It featured texts by poets Philip Paxton and Brent Cootes. And Brent's text came from the first openly gay book of poetry published in New Zealand. That was in 1994, and it was titled I Know. Well, during these days, it was also sung at the 30th anniversary of Homosexual Law Reform, the event that was held at Parliament on the 6th of July.
Well, St Andrew's on the Terrace is the oldest Presbyterian congregation in New Zealand. They held a service on Petone foreshore literally within the first couple of days of arriving here in Wellington. That's the European settlers arriving here in Wellington in 1840. The church has seen a number of locations around Wellington, in Thorndon, on Lambton Quay, and here from the 1920s on the Terrace.
Now, over the years, the church has been supportive of a number of social justice causes. For instance, the congregation here protested against the 1981 Springbok tour and apartheid. They also stood in support of homosexual law reform in the mid-1980s, and more recently they've supported the Aotearoa Living Wage movement, refugee and migrant support services, and marriage equality. On the 8th of December 1991, after homophobic resolutions were passed in the Presbyterian Church's General Assembly, St Andrew's here declared itself to be an inclusive church, and there were numerous same-sex commitment ceremonies held here during the 1990s. But there have also been regular LGBTI Rainbow Church services here since 1992.
And one of those people leading those services has been the Reverend Dr. Margaret Mayman. And Margaret is no longer with St Andrews. I think Margaret is based in Australia now. But Margaret was very, very much at the forefront for advocating for marriage equality in 2012, 2013, and before that. And actually, on the day of marriage equality, when it first went into Parliament, there was a rally on the steps of Parliament, and Margaret stood up, and unfortunately she had lost her voice that day, so her partner read her words. Some of those words are, quote, "The biblical call to compassion, to love your neighbour as yourself, provides the faith mandate for marriage equality. Today we affirm the dignity and worth of all people and recognise sexual difference and diversity as a blessed part of our created being."
That's great. Unfortunately, some churches have been staunchly opposed to same-sex marriage and homosexual law reform, and I'm thinking particularly in the mid-1980s of the Salvation Army, which rallied against law reform. Now, the Army was integral in collecting signatures for the Keith Hay and Peter Tate anti-law reform petition. The petition was presented, as you can see in this picture here, on the steps of Parliament in 1985, and it was quickly dubbed, this is the ceremony around it, was dubbed the Nuremberg Rally because it resembled the infamous torch-lit, flag-carrying 1936 Nazi Party rallies at Nuremberg. Now, the presentation featured platoons of young people, women in blue uniforms, men in white shirts carrying New Zealand flags and wearing sashes emblazoned with the words, "For God, for country, for family." Well, a procession of people carried the 91 cardboard boxes containing the petition, one from each parliamentary electorate, up the steps to stack in front of Parliament's doors, and the boxes were handed to MPs Norman Jones, Graham Lee, John Banks and Jeff Braybrook. Now, the organisers hoped for 1 million signatures, which would be about a third of the population at the time. They claimed over 800,000 actually signed the form. However, a quick calculation by opponents revealed that only a small stack of papers could be in each of the boxes, in each of the 91 closed boxes there. So they began chanting, "The boxes are empty." Later, though, many of the signatures were found to be duplicates or forged. Whole families signed in the one hand, for instance, or facetious names like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. Some people, including school students, felt pressured into signing. If you don't sign, you must be a pufter, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Although it was, a lot of the signatures were unverified or forgeries, it was still a very large petition, wasn't it? The largest petition in New Zealand actually happened last year, which is quite interesting, and that was for the gay conversion therapy, against gay conversion therapy, and that was a huge petition. So we've just lost Google Maps because it's a bit hard because the next stop is actually down on Lambton Quay, and I've just centered the, very quietly in the background, I've centered the image and I'll turn that off. And should we go to Lambton Quay?
To our next stop, which features the writer Frank Sargeson, who was born Norris Davey in Hamilton in 1903. Now, in the late 1920s, Norris got a job at the Public Trust, and he worked in this building here, the Public Trust building. Built in 1908, this building is believed to be New Zealand's first steel-framed office building. Well, by day, Norris worked here, and by nights, he cruised the toilets and beats of Wellington. Now, cruising means looking for anonymous sex. One night in 1929, he met Leonard Hollobin, who was known to the police and was being monitored. The two went back to Leonard's boarding house, where the police were lying in wait in the next room. Bursting in on the two, they found them in flagrante delicto, masturbating each other, or in legal terms, committing indecent assault. Now, Norris was persuaded by the Crown to give evidence against Leonard and allow himself to be presented as the innocent party. So in return, he received a suspended sentence, while Leonard got 5 years hard labour at New Plymouth Prison. Well, after the court case, Norris went to stay with his much-loved uncle up north, but after a couple of years he was forced off the land because of the Depression, but he emerged rather butterfly-like as Frank Sargeson, the writer. In 2017, during the first reading of a bill to expunge historic gay convictions, Justice Minister Amy Adams made an apology on behalf of the government to all those who were affected by historic gay convictions, and the bill was passed unopposed and became law in 2018, and the first two expungements happened later that year.
Well, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage now occupy part of the building, and they have named a number of their meeting rooms with the names of famous New Zealanders, and one of them was Frida Stark. And this is a photo of Frida. So Frida is being lifted. I'm not sure who the male dancer is, but Frida was born in 1907 in Northland, and soon after that the family moved to Auckland. And from a very early age, Frida began dancing, and so she was doing things like hula hoop, she was doing high kicks and tumbles. In the 1930s, she started ballet, and then in the 1940s, she was doing exotic dancing. And by the time that the American troops were in Auckland in the 1940s, she was known as the Fever of the Fleet, and she would be dancing at the Civic Theatre completely naked apart from a G-string, but completely painted in gold paint, and was very well known throughout New Zealand and the US forces. Well, our story involves Frida, but also another dancer called Thelma Trott, and Frida and Thelma met in the mid-1930s, and they started a relationship. At the time, Thelma was also married to Eric Mario, and Eric Mario really did not like this other relationship, and so he actually poisoned Thelma. I think it was some sleeping pills, and she actually died. So Eric was charged and tried for her murder, and Frida Stark was a Crown witness and so appeared at the trial. And it was really, it was just really nasty. They basically took apart Frida's personal life and they aired it in court, and they showed naked images of Frida, and it was just very invasive. Anyway, Eric was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. And in fact, he actually had a number of retrials. I think they went through another 2 trials, and each time he was found guilty. His final sentence, which was death, was actually then commuted to life imprisonment. For those 3 trials, Frida had to testify, and so just being dragged through the court system 3 times would have been pretty unbearable, I imagine. After the court trials, Frida went to the United Kingdom, but returned to New Zealand in the 1970s. And in the late 90s, I think 1999, when Frida died, her friends actually buried her under at the bottom of Thelma's grave, and this is a shot of the grave in Waikumete Cemetery in Auckland, with "Waiting Till We Meet Again, Frida" at the bottom of Thelma's grave.
So nice thing to do. So just along from the Public Trust Office is Wellington's Midland Park, and Midland Park features a wonderful sculpture of Catherine Mansfield. The sculpture is called Woman of Words, and it's by the Auckland sculptor Virginia King. Now, it commemorates the life and work of one of New Zealand's most famous writers. And during the day, the sculpture reflects the movement of the life surrounding the sculpture, and then at night it becomes illuminated from within like a lantern, which is great. Catherine Mansfield was born in 1888, and at the age of 19 she left New Zealand and settled in the United Kingdom, where she became a friend of modernist writers like D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. In 1917 she was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which led to her death in 1923 at the age of 34. Now, she has well-documented relationships with both men and women, and the first same-sex romantic relationship that we know of is with Mata Mahapuku, a wealthy young Māori woman whom she had first met at school in Wellington. Now, Mansfield wrote, "I want Mata, I want her as I have had her, terribly. This is unclean, I know, but true." And then the second relationship that we know of is with Edith Kathleen Bendel, and Mansfield writes and posts letters in violet ink nightly to Edith and invites her to stay alone with her at the family batch just across Wellington Harbour at Days Bay. Mansfield writes in her journal, "Last night I spent in her arms, and tonight I hate her," which being interpreted means that I adore her, that I cannot lie in my bed and not feel the magic of her body. I feel more powerfully all those so-termed sexual impulses with her than I have with any man. Well, a favourite quote from Mansfield is, risk anything, care no more for the opinions of others, for those voices. Do the hardest thing on earth for you, act for yourself, face the truth." It's a great quote.
Great quote. Well, to tie Catherine back to Frank Sargeson, who we've been talking about previously, this is an image of Frank Sargeson in the Catherine Mansfield garden. This is Frank getting the Catherine Mansfield Literary Award in 1965. And to the left of Frank we have Dame Ngaio Marsh, who was a writer and an incredibly talented director here in New Zealand as well. So that was quite a nice tie-in. Well, one of the other things about Midland Park is that Midland Park used to be the Midland Hotel, and there's an image here of the Midland Hotel. The Midland Hotel stretched quite a bit of the block. On the right-hand side of that image we have Kirkcaldy and Staines, which is now David Jones, and so where that sculpture is of Catherine Mansfield is actually on the furthest left-hand side of the multi-storey Midland Park Hotel. And the Midland Park Hotel was famous. It had some really famous people stay there, including Somerset Maugham, the UK writer and dramatist, who was very famous. He was staying there in 1917 with his partner, Gerald Haxton. And here's a photo of Somerset here. And at the time, Somerset was very famous. He had already had 10 plays published, and they were on their way to Tahiti. And they both met during the start of World War I. Gerald was from San Francisco and was part of the ambulance corps in France, and that's where Somerset and he met. At the time, Somerset was actually married to Siri Wellcome, and that marriage lasted for about 13 years, I think. But years later, Somerset confided in his nephew Robin about his bisexuality, and he said, quote, "I tried to persuade myself that I was 3/4 normal and that only 1/4 of me was queer, whereas really it was the other way round."
Well, the Midland Hotel was demolished in 1980 to make way for Midland Park, and it was here in February 2015 that the feminist, trans activist and community icon Shelley Tawairiki Howard conducted a social experiment and an education campaign which highlighted the differences between tolerance and acceptance. There's a great image here of Shelley taken by Kate Spencer. Now, Shelley stood blindfolded in this experiment with her arms outstretched and two signs beside her. One summarised data from the Youth 2012 survey, which showed that despite the many hardships faced by transgender youth, they were the most active in youth communities and helping and assisting others. And the second sign read, "I am transgender. I honour you. Will you honour me? Awhi mai, hug me." Well, in an interview with Jack Lynch, Shelley recalled that she'd engaged with around 25 people that day, and how with some people she could feel the distance between them even though they were hugging, but with others the hearts engaged and she could feel the sincerity. Reflecting on those interactions, Shelley said, well, now that you've got this information, what are you going to tell your children? What are you going to tell your partner? Are you going to go to the local school board of trustees and tell them that we have to do more for queer identifying youth? Well, sadly, Shelley passed away in November 2017.
We're going to walk now virtually to the waterfront, which is around about a 5 or 6 minute walk, but through modern technology, we're now here.
Hooray! The Wellington Waterfront, just over 100 years ago, on the 16th of October 1914, almost 8,500 men and nearly 4,000 horses sailed from these wharves for the First World War. 10 troop ships were in the harbour, leaving on that day, and on board were 2 soldiers, Norman Gibson and Roy Ayling. Now, they met either at Trentham military camp or possibly in Egypt a little bit later in the year on their way to Europe. They became lovers. Roy was 28 and Norman was 19. The artist Tos Williston noted in his autobiography, Sage Tea, that Roy had told me how he had seen the younger while at the war poised for a dive when they were swimming and loved his beautiful body. Well, they were together during the Battle of the Somme, and Norman was wounded and evacuated, and Roy wrote this poem to him. It was published in the 1917 book New Zealand at the Front. Form like Hercules of old, mighty limbs and shapely mould, manly strength in beauty rolled, old sunshine. Now that we are far apart, longing makes the hot tears start. Who can ease my aching heart? Old sunshine. Well, after the war, Roy and Norman bought a farm together. Roy left Norman in 1931 and they both subsequently married women. And then in 1997, Norman's daughter Miriam Safira wrote a biography of her father called A Man's Man, A Daughter's Story.
Our next stop is actually looking into the harbour, and it's actually the little island between Roger and I in this image in the background here. Just a small tiny island called Matusomes, and this is an island that was used during World War I and at other times to hold a variety of people, and in the World War I it was used as an intern camp to hold enemy aliens. And the person we're going to be talking about is Dr. Helma von Danneville, and the doctor arrived in New Zealand after 1910 and helped set up a health clinic in Miramar on the Miramar Peninsula. And right from the outset, the doctor raised some eyebrows because of Helma's dress and clothing. It had been referred to as hair being super short, a tailored skirt and jacket, a shirt, tie, and a mannish hat. The doctor had also been known to have an unusual influence over female clientele at the health practice. Well, when war broke out, the Anti-German Women's League got very suspicious of Helma and forced or requested an official investigation. And so the Solicitor General of New Zealand investigated Helma and actually performed a physical examination. The Solicitor General reported, quote, "There is a grave ground for suspicion that this person is a mischievous and dangerous impostor. There's much reason to suspect that she may be a man masquerading as a woman." Well, as I say, they did a physical examination, and from that it was revealed that in fact she was a woman. But even though that happened, she was interned on Matusomes Island on the 26th of May 1917. She was the only woman on the island, and she lasted 6 weeks before having a severe nervous breakdown, and was taken off the island and into the custody of a Mr. Spencer. Well, after the war, Helmer left New Zealand with another woman and that woman's children, and they travelled to Australia and then on to San Francisco. And Helmer actually died in 1930, I think it was, in San Francisco. The full investigation is actually available online now. If you go to the Archives New Zealand website, I think it's called Archway, and you search for Helmer von Danneville, and I've got to say that the name is spelt in a number of different ways, but if you Google the name you'll come up with it, but the actual digitized investigation file is now available online.
Well, on now to our next stop, which is Frank Kitts Park, which you can see there, just...
Or the lagoon, really, isn't it?
It's a lagoon,
it's
in
more
fact,
the
actually,
lagoon,
yes,
yeah.
all right, well, there we go, in that sort of area. Frank Kitts Park was the starting point for the 2016 Pride Parade. It was also the venue for the Candlelight Memorial in June 2016 for the victims of the Orlando nightclub massacre. Beyond that, Frank Kitts Lagoon was the venue for the Beacons of Hope AIDS Candlelight Memorials in the 1990s. And at the memorial's peak in 1993, services were held right throughout the country, from Kaitaia, Tauranga, Rotorua, Nelson, Christchurch, Timaru, Hamilton, Napier, Palmerston North, Blenheim, Dunedin and Invercargill. In Auckland there was a memorial service at St Matthew's in the city, followed by lighting of flaming torches. And here in Wellington, torches were held high, and the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra and the National Youth Choir performed here at Frank Kitts Lagoon.
Well, one of the taonga that is held at Te Papa on the waterfront, and I think we've actually got a shot of the waterfront here where Te Papa is, if I can find it. So Te Papa is just behind me, in fact, that big building on the right hand side. They hold the New Zealand AIDS Memorial Quilt, and the quilt was originally inspired by Cleve Jones in San Francisco in, I think it was about 1984, and it was to create a panel for loved ones that had passed away or had AIDS, and each panel is 6 foot by 3 foot, which is the size of a grave, and it was to be used as a memorial, a living memorial that would also be an education tool as well. In New Zealand, the idea really took off in 1988 when Daniel Fielding and the People with AIDS Collective decided to create a New Zealand AIDS Memorial Quilt. And the first quilt panel was for Daniel's partner, and there's a photo here of this is Peter Cuthbert's AIDS Memorial Quilt panel, and that was presented on the 1st of December 1988 as the first panel in the quilt. So the quilt can be seen by request if you just contact Te Papa, and you'll be able to see the quilt. It's also online. If you search for New Zealand AIDS Memorial Quilt, you can see all the panels online as well.
And finally on our tour, another influence coming out of San Francisco was the rainbow flag, which has been picked up by many LGBTI rainbow communities around the world. As part of Wellington's Pride Parade in 2017, a 50-metre long version of the rainbow flag was paraded for the first time in New Zealand, down Courtney Place and onto the waterfront heading towards Waitangi Park. Now this particular flag was created in the United Kingdom by a group of people whose partners had passed away from AIDS-related conditions, and the flag's been carried down the streets of London, Paris, Sydney and Singapore. The original rainbow flag was created by the US-based activist and artist Gilbert Baker as part of a collective in 1978, but he refused to trademark the rainbow flag, seeing it as a symbol that was for LGBTI rainbow communities to own, not for one individual.
And to tie us right back to where we started, which was at Parliament, we've got these fantastic shots. This is a shot from 2016, and this is the first time ever that the rainbow flag had been flown on the forecourt of Parliament, and this was to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Homosexual Law Reform Bill being passed into an act. So that flew, and that's an image from Jack Lynch. And then we also have an image here of 4 flags. We've got the bisexual, intersex, rainbow and transgender flags. And this is the first time that the intersex flag, or the first time that these 4 flags had actually flown anywhere in the world at the seat of Parliament, at the seat of government. The reason why these were flying in 2018 was the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, Transphobia and Intersex Phobia, and it's just really lovely to see that again New Zealand is leading the way. And there are even more flags within Parliament itself, Parliament buildings. There is a select committee room called the Rainbow Room, and you can see here that there are lots of flags around the wall for a whole variety of different communities. There's a wonderful artwork in the centre by Dr. Elizabeth Kerekere. There are out MP photographs on the right hand side, and you can't see it on this photograph, but behind us there are significant pieces of legislation printed and framed on the walls.
Great. Well, that ends this tour around the Parliament precinct of Wellington. We should thank once again Alison Laurie, Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young for their research, and thank you for watching. If you've got any feedback, feel free to give it to us. You can comment on the YouTube page here, or you can go to comment.
Oh no, the commenting on the page is fine. Or we're also on Facebook as
That's
well.
right.
If you look for
Facebook.
Walktours NZ. We have got another virtual walk tour on Sunday the 16th of January at 1 p.m. It will be a different walk tour. You're more than welcome to join us. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and have a good afternoon.
Ka kite.
Bye.